It was a pretty upscale affair, with smooth jazz playing softly in the background, champagne flutes clinking, and the air heavy with the scent of expensive cologne. The night was young, but the heat from the bodies packed into the room already made the grand living room feel warmer than it should. Wife, Laura. She looked stunning in that red dress. Maybe it was a little too stunning, though. It clung to her curves and her eyes sparkled. Something felt different. Of course, it wasn't the first time I'd noticed how the room seemed to light up when she walked in, but tonight was different. Maybe. It was her laugh, which was a little louder than usual. I noticed her glancing across the room, and my gut tightened as my eyes followed hers. There, he was, Ethan, her coworker. He was tall and charming, with a chiseled jawline that had every woman at the office fawning over him. They'd worked together for years. They'd been together for years, and I'd heard all about him. Every compliment, every little story about what a great guy he was. Yeah, sure, great guy. But tonight, Laura wasn't just talking about him. She was absorbed by him. I didn't think much of it at first. They were standing by the grand piano, and from where I was sitting, I could see them laughing together. Some old college buddies. It looked harmless enough. I told myself it was nothing, but as the night wore on, I couldn't ignore it. The way her hand would linger on his arm just a little too long, or how she'd throw her head back in laughter every time he spoke. She was clearly enchanted. I chuckled more to myself than at her. I was more preoccupied with my own thoughts than with what my friends were saying. I forced myself to stay engaged in the conversation, nodding along to some story that I didn't really care about. But my mind kept wandering back to Laura and Ethan. I could see the way he looked at her like a predator watching its prey. I shook my head, trying to clear it. She'd been with me for 10 years. She wasn't that kind of woman. As the night continued, I made my rounds, but every time I glanced over, there they were, still deep in conversation. A bit too close now and then, I heard it, the words that made my blood run cold. "He's such a good man," she said. It was meant to be an innocent comment, but the way she said it, the admiration dripping from her voice, this was something else. My grip on my glass tightened. I decided I needed some air. I excused myself from my friends, making my way across the room to the bathroom, but not before glancing at her. Once more, she didn't even notice me leave. Too busy with Ethan. He's a perfect gentleman, isn't he? I pushed the door open to the hallway, the sound of the party growing distant as I walked. My head was pounding. He's such a good man. I replayed the words in my head, the way her voice softened when she said them. I needed to get it. Together, maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was just the champagne messing with my head. But then, just as I approached the bathroom, I heard something. Low voices. Familiar voices. Laura's laugh. Not the one I knew. The genuine one that warmed my heart. But a different kind. Playful. Flirtatious. My pulse quickened. I followed the sound around the corner to a secluded part of the hallway, and there they were. I stood frozen, my hand gripping the doorframe so hard my knuckles turned white. Ethan had her pinned gently against the wall, his lips brushing hers. The look in her eyes. God, the way she looked at him, it wasn't confusion. Or maybe it was surprise, but it was more like desire. I wanted it too. Before I could even think about what I was doing, something snapped inside me. I stormed down the hallway, the sound of my footsteps alerting them. Ethan barely had time to pull back before I was on him. My fist connected with his jaw, sending him crashing into the wall. "Leave my wife alone," I growled, my voice colder than I thought possible. Ethan staggered, holding his jaw. His eyes were wide in shock. Laura gasped, scrambling to compose herself. "It's not what it looks like," she stammered, reaching out to me, but I wasn't listening. I grabbed Ethan by the collar, yanking him to his feet. "Leave her alone," I said, my voice firm but controlled. "Get out," I said, my voice low and controlled, but I could feel the fury boiling just beneath the surface. He didn't need to be told twice. He stumbled down the hallway, not even bothering to pick up his jacket, muttering something about how it was a mistake. "Yeah, damn right, it was a mistake," I said, turning to Laura. She was trembling and her face was pale. Tears were welling up in her eyes, but I held up a hand to stop her speaking. I told her not to worry, not to come here, not now. The party was still going on in the next room. I was still oblivious to the explosion that had just taken place in the shadows of that quiet hallway. I took a deep breath and forced myself to keep it together. But inside I was already plotting. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. You see, the thing about betrayal is that it doesn't just break you, it changes you. And now it was my turn. We didn't speak as we left the party. The car ride home was suffocatingly silent. The tension was thick enough to choke on. I kept my eyes on the road. Gripping the steering wheel tighter than I should have, I was trying to calm the storm raging inside me. Laura was sitting beside me, her hands nervously twisting the edge of her dress, her gaze fixed out the window. She hadn't even tried to explain herself. What could she say? My mind was racing with images of her with Ethan was pinned against the wall, their lips so close it played on repeat in my head, gnawing at my insides. Every glance she threw his way, every laugh. He's such a good man. I laughed bitterly to myself. The kind of man that steals another's wife. Perfect. I thought about pulling over and confronting her right there on the side of the road. I needed to get off the road and give her a chance to explain. I wasn't ready to hear her excuses, though. I needed time to process, plan, and figure out exactly how I was going to handle this. It wasn't something you just forgive and forget. This required something more deliberate. I pulled into the driveway, and the headlights cast long shadows against the house we built together. It was funny how I'd once loved this place, but now it felt like a prison. I turned off the engine but didn't move. Laura shifted uncomfortably in her seat, waiting for me to say something to make the first move. Finally, she spoke. Her voice trembled as she said, "I'm sorry." I let the words hang in the air for a moment, their weight heavy and meaningless. "I'm sorry, that's all I have to say after what I just saw." "I'm sorry," I echoed, still staring straight ahead. My voice was cold and detached. "That's what you've got." She swallowed hard, her eyes pleading. "It didn't mean anything. I swear it was just a mistake. I don't even know what I was thinking. It was stupid. It was stupid." I cut her off, finally turning to face her. "So, Laura, at what point did it become stupid? Was it when you were laughing at his jokes? When you touched his arm? Or maybe it was when you let him kiss you?" My voice grew sharper. As she spoke, the anger bubbled up again, threatening to spill over and make her cry. Well, she should cry. She should feel every bit of pain she had just inflicted on me. It was a mistake. She whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you. I love you. I love you now." That was rich. It was a funny way of showing. I said, my tone dripping with sarcasm, "Is that how you treat someone you love? By getting cozy with your coworker at a party? By letting him what make you feel special?" She flinched at my words, but I didn't care. She deserved it. Every ounce of guilt, every tear, every moment of shame. She deserved it all. "I don't know what happened," she continued, her voice barely audible. "I just wasn't thinking. I don't blame him." I snapped, cutting her off again. "Don't try to put this on him. He may be a piece of, but you're the one who let it happen. You're the one who betrayed me." I could see the guilt written all over her face. The way she couldn't meet my eyes. She knew exactly what she had done, but that didn't make it any better, or make it hurt any less. We sat in silence for a long moment, punctuated only by the sound of our breathing. I could feel the rage simmering just beneath the surface, but I forced it down. Not yet. I couldn't afford to lose control, not now. There was too much at stake. Finally, I spoke. My voice was low and steady. "We're not talking about this tonight." She blinked, confused. I turned to face her, my expression cold and calculating. "You heard me. We're not talking about this tonight. Go inside and get some sleep. We'll talk about it tomorrow." Her face crumpled, the tears threatening to spill over. But I was firm. "I'm not ready to have this conversation, and you don't want to have it with me right now." She hesitated, torn between wanting to explain and fearing what might happen. I don't know what came next, but she must have seen something in my eyes. It was like she knew pushing me wasn't the right move, so she nodded and wiped at her tears as she reached for the door handle. As she got out of the car, I watched her walk toward the house. Her steps were slow and hesitant for a moment, and I felt a flicker of something. Maybe it was pity at first, but it didn't last. It was replaced by that cold, gnawing anger. She had chosen this. She had made her bed, and now she was going to lie in it. I stayed in the car for a while longer, staring out at the dark, empty street and the quiet night. It didn't calm the storm inside me. I knew what I had to do. She knew this wasn't going to end with a simple conversation or a few tears and apologies. This was going to be different. She could play me for a fool. She could cry her way out of this, But she didn't realize that I wasn't the same man she thought she knew. She had no idea what she had just done. As I spoke, I took a deep breath and began to plan my next move. This wasn't about revenge, at least not in the way most people thought. It wasn't about yelling or throwing things or even storming out. This was going to be far more methodical and controlled. I smiled to myself, feeling a cold satisfaction. I smiled bitterly. The games had begun. The next morning the house was suffocatingly quiet. Laura tiptoed around like a shadow, trying not to disturb the invisible storm she knew was brewing. I could feel her eyes on me as I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, flipping through the paper as if nothing had happened. It was as if her betrayal wasn't hanging over us like a black cloud ready to burst. I wasn't ready to confront her yet. I had to be smart about this. She didn't need to know how deep the knife had cut, or that I was already thinking about my next move. The worst thing I could do now was let her see me angry. Let her think she had any control over this situation because, in the end, it's all about control. As she passed by, pretending to busy herself with mundane tasks like straightening cushions and wiping a countertop that was already clean, I could feel the tension radiating off her. She was waiting for me to snap, the inevitable explosion that would follow a night like last night. But I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction, not yet. "Do you want some breakfast?" she asked, her voice tentative and fragile. I didn't look up from the paper. There was a long pause and the air was thick with unspoken words. She stood there, probably hoping. I thought about saying something more, hoping we could have the talk that she thought would fix everything, but I wasn't interested in talking, not yet. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to." I set the paper down and looked at her. Just looked, and that was enough. Her words trailed off, and her face crumpled under the weight. My silence spoke volumes. I didn't need to raise my voice or scream. Silence can be louder than words when used correctly. Finally, she broke. "I know I messed up. I know what I did was wrong, but I love you. You have to believe that." I leaned back in my chair, folded my arms across my chest, and watched. Her squirming made me ask, in a calm, detached voice, if I really had to believe that here. Tears filled my eyes again, but I didn't care. I wasn't interested in her tears, not anymore. I could see the desperation on her face, and the way her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the counter, looking for something, anything, that I couldn't believe it. She was sobbing. She said she didn't mean for any of it to happen. But there it was again. She was trying to turn this into something that just happened, like she was a passive passenger in her own betrayal, like she hadn't been making choices, like she hadn't wanted it. I stood up. I walked up slowly, taking my time, letting the tension build. "Laura," I said softly, stepping closer. "You didn't mean for me to find out that's what you're really sorry about?" She opened her mouth to protest, but I cut her off with a cold smile. "I believe you when you say you love me," I said. It's a shame that love wasn't enough to stop you looking at other options." Her face showed guilt, and she took a step towards me as if that would make a difference. It was a mistake. It was just one moment of weakness and it meant nothing. "Stop," I said, my voice low but firm. "You've said enough." I watched her crumble. I was indifferent to her excuses and didn't care why she did it. I just watched her fall apart, piece by piece. I could see it in the way her shoulders slumped, the way she bit her lip to hold back tears. I wasn't used to this version of me. I was detached and calm, while he was losing his mind. She didn't know how to deal with it, and that's exactly what I wanted. "You think this is over?" I said, stepping even closer and speaking in a low voice. "You think we're just going to sit down, have a talk, and—" "Don't you think we should move on from this?" she asked, her eyes wide with hope. "I just want us to fix this. We can get through this. I know we can." I shook my head, laughing darkly. "Laura, we're not going to fix this. There's no fixing what you've done. If you leave, it'll be too easy. We're going to stay right here together, and you're going to learn what it feels like to live with the consequences of your actions." Her face went pale as she understood what I meant. "What do you mean?" I smiled coldly. "You'll find out." I turned and walked past. She left, standing there trembling and crying. I wasn't done with her, not by a long shot. She needed to think about what she'd done, and I was going to make sure she did. The next few days were silent. I didn't yell, didn't raise my voice, and didn't even argue. I just let her know that things would never be the same again. Every time she tried to talk, I would nod, maybe give a short answer, and then go back to whatever I was doing, leaving her to drown in her own guilt. It was fascinating to watch her unravel. She tried so hard to reach me, but I was coldly indifferent. She cried herself to sleep, thinking I didn't hear her, but I did. I heard every tear and sniffle, and it felt like a small victory. But this was only the beginning. I wasn't going to let her wallow in guilt and shame. I needed her to pay for what she had done, and not just emotionally. I needed her to feel the consequences in every aspect of her life. I started making moves. I didn't touch her phone, but I knew her passcode. I wasn't going to just let her wallow in guilt and shame. That wasn't enough. I needed her to face the consequences of her actions, not just emotionally, but in every aspect of her life. I started making moves. I didn't touch her phone, but I didn't need to. I knew her passcode. I'd known it for years, so it wasn't hard to log into her social media accounts and her email. She'd find out soon enough that things weren't going to be as easy as she thought, but that was just the start. There were other, more subtle ways to make her suffer, ways she wouldn't even notice at first, like changing little things. In the house, I hid small items she used daily, making her question her sanity bit by bit. Gaslighting? Maybe. But when it's deserved, it feels more like justice. And Ethan? I hadn't forgotten about him. He would get his turn too, but for now, Laura was my focus. She was the one who needed to learn her lesson. I'd make sure of it the following morning. The air was thick with tension. Laura moved around the house like a ghost. Her eyes were puffy from crying. Her movements were slow and unsure. She was waiting for something. I had to make a decision. I had to tell her where we stood. I didn't realize I'd already made up my mind today. Everything changed. I watched her from the kitchen as she quietly packed up her things for work. Her phone buzzed on the counter. It was probably Ethan again. I was still desperate for a conversation, but he didn't matter anymore. Not in the way Laura thought. I dealt with it. I was thinking about what she'd done and how she'd feel when she finally left the house. I went to work first. I called my lawyer. Divorce felt final just thinking the word, but it was already happening. Laura had made her choices, and now I was making mine. A sharp guy I'd known for years picked up immediately. "It's time," I said simply. "There's no need for explanation. I'll start the paperwork and file today. Do you need any advice about the situation at home?" I thought about it for a moment, my eyes flicking to the front door where I replied that I'd already taken care of it. After hanging up, I stood there for a moment, letting the reality of the situation sink in. This was it. There would be no going back, no second chances. The end of our life together was coming, and there was nothing she could do about it. I had control now, and I wasn't about to let her. By the time Laura got back that evening, the house was really quiet. She opened the front door and came in, looking a bit unsure of herself. She seemed to know something was coming, but couldn't quite put her finger on it. She looked over at me, sitting on the couch in the living room, but I didn't say anything. I just let her stand there in the doorway, clutching her purse, waiting for me to speak. She knew it was coming, whatever it was, and the silence only made her more nervous. She asked, "Can we talk?" in a soft, barely audible whisper. I stood up slowly, taking my time, and walked past her toward the front door. She looked confused as I unlocked the door and opened it wide. "Get out," I said, my voice cold. Her eyes widened, confusion giving way to panic. She took a step forward as if she hadn't heard me correctly. "Wait," I cut her off. "What are you doing here?" My voice was sharp and unwavering. "Get out of this house." Tears welled up in her eyes. "You don't mean that," she pleaded, shaking her head in disbelief. "We can work through this. We can. There's no we anymore." "Laura," I stepped closer, my voice lowering to a dangerous calm. "You had your chance. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. I want you out now." Her face crumpled. The reality of the situation suddenly hit her, and she opened her mouth to protest, but nothing came out. She just stood there, shaking, tears streaming down her face. "Where am I supposed to go?" she whispered, her voice breaking. I shrugged, completely detached. "It's not my problem. You can go to Ethan if you want. Maybe he has room for you." She flinched when she heard his name, her tears falling harder. "Please, don't do this," she begged, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry. I'll do anything you want." "You're right." I cut her off again. "You're sorry, but it's too late for that." The coldness in my voice seemed to knock the wind out of her, and she took a shaky step backward. her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. She looked around the house, the place we'd shared for years, as if she couldn't believe what was happening. But it didn't matter. None of it mattered anymore. "I've already filed for divorce," I said, my voice steady. "You'll get the papers soon. I suggest you find a lawyer." The color drained from her face. Her hand flew to her mouth as if she'd been physically, "No, you can't. We can fix this. We can go to counseling. There's nothing to fix," I said, stepping towards her. "You broke this, Laura. You shattered everything. Now you'll live with the consequences," I added coldly. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed into the nearest chair, covering her face as she sobbed. I felt nothing but contempt for her. She had brought this on herself. For a moment I considered helping her up and telling her to calm down, but then I remembered the way she had kissed Ethan at that party. Her eyes had sparkled with excitement when she thought I wasn't looking. That image played in my mind, fueling my anger. The fire inside me. "Get out of here by tomorrow." My voice was cold and final. "Take whatever you need, but don't think about coming back. This house is mine now." Her sobs grew louder, but I was done listening. I turned and walked away, leaving her in a crumpled heap on the chair. She could cry all she wanted, but it wouldn't change a thing. I'd made up my mind. There was no going back. By the time I made it upstairs, I heard the sound of her packing. She was packing frantically and desperately, shuffling through her clothes and belongings. She wasn't going to fight me. She knew she'd lost that night. The house was quiet. No more tearful apologies, no more begging, no more guilt, just peace. I poured myself a drink, sitting on the couch. I let the cool burn of whiskey soothe me. The papers were in motion, and soon she would be out of my life for good. I stared at the empty space where her keys used to hang, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over me for the first time in weeks. I felt like I was back in control. I had my life back. I had my dignity. As for Laura, she was nothing more. It was just a memory now. Something I'd learned from, but one I'd never make again. I took a sip of my whiskey. The door clicked shut and I was alone, exactly where I wanted to be. Subscribe and stay one step ahead of cheaters. Trust me, the next story makes this one look like a fairy tale.